Hey guys, welcome back for more tutorials. My name is Magnet, and let's talk about using roaches against Terran today. We're going to talk a lot about the timings that can be utilized with roach strategies, the overall idea that's kind of to go with the roaches, and transitions in case you need to, or as the game goes on you definitely will want to. So let's just go ahead and jump in without saying too much more. This is going to be Vortex versus MMA. And Vortex is definitely a very good European Zerg. MMA, Terran, we're going to take a look at over here. Now I should note that some Roach mix-ins can be used just basically to defend against Hellions or Hellbat play. So you can use Roaches, but not commit to them to being a more long-term strategy. This video is mainly going to be about using Roaches as the mainstay in your army composition for basically the entire game. Maybe switching off of them if need be to go into a more normal game if you need to. So what we're going to see here is a hatch first and then into a pull here from Vortex. Really normal stuff. Notice how he's not actually taking gas right away. So this is a little bit of a later speed, but it could be for faster Roaches, and this is actually a fairly common thing to do against Terran if you want to try for earlier victories rather than trying to drag out a longer game. So Vortex is going to try and hit a Roach timing here once he gets everything set up. So should see him take both of his gases here in the main fairly soon. See one right now, and that was actually, I think, to protect against a Reaper. So he does just go ahead and take the both of them down here anyway. So he's going to go 3 out of 3 on gas at the bottom, and this is going to basically allow him to take a third base, but he can also post some aggression behind this. Note that he's not really adding speed, because if you want to stay on Roaches for the longer term of the game, circling speed isn't all that vital. You can spend your money pretty equally on Roaches and with other support, considering Roaches are fairly light in the gas category for supply. So we'll notice that no Zergling speed has been researched here, and if you want to do any sort of Roach timings especially, it's okay to skip that. It may be a little bit of a giveaway that there's going to be something weird going on if the Terran doesn't see speed at a certain time. But as long as you can keep your third protected, like I said, these Roaches can oftentimes just to push away Hellions and Reapers and stuff like this fairly solidly. But using these Queens in excess, you can see he has 3 Queens hanging out back here, as well as 1 plugging his wall just to prevent the Hellions from running in. He's kind of trying to mask this Roach build the best he can. But getting this third base secured is definitely very important, but hitting this Roach timing as crisply as possible is going to be really strong. Now he starts Zergling speed later on, realizing that if he wants to go into a later game, maybe he doesn't want to stay on Roaches the entire time. The reason he waited this long is so he could get his Roaches started faster than waiting for speed to be researched and mining gas earlier. So he does eventually take it, and that's because if you go for Roaches as far as on one of these timings, if it doesn't kill him right away, you can still transition into a Spire and Ling Baneling type of strategy. You will note he is adding on the Baneling Nest, but this is mainly to help the Roach attack kind of succeed on the other side. So he adds on a handful of Roaches. Typically about 10 is pretty common, so he's adding on these handful of Roaches, and he's producing a lot of Zerglings here. And note that he's making it look like he wants to take, this third base, but he's not going to drone it for a while, because while he's moving across the map, he's actually going to start putting these Banelings together, and he's going to try to break down the Terran wall as soon as possible, just to try and get in there and deal some early damage. So let's go ahead and get this started back up here. You see the Banelings morphing right now, and they're kind of out of the way so that the Terran might not really know about it. He does realize what's going on though, and the whole idea here is you want to try to get the Banelings to hit SCVs if you can, but if they're here repairing it as hard as they can, try to deal a little bit of damage with these Roaches and then crash into the bunker with the Banelings. What the Terran's supposed to do behind this is build extra bunkers. That's why you can see him desperately doing this right now. But if you get in here fast enough and if you hit this timing crisply enough, oftentimes you will deal damage, but you shouldn't be expecting to kill them, although sometimes it will. So we're seeing the attack come up here. The Banelings start to run into the bunker. Typically you want to do that a little bit faster, but now he at least does have Banelings left over to try and hit these SCVs and maybe the Marines and stuff. And the Roaches are really going to be what's really hard for the Terran to remove most of the time, especially if they opened up with those Hellion builds. So this type of play, it's not usually something you could just blindly go for. You might run into things like tanks, and if you do, then your push is pretty much doomed. The reason he did this is because the Terrans typically do open up with Reapers and Hellions, and both his units are really terrible as far as killing Roaches. So that's why you will see this timing mixed in, and if you can scout the Terran going for Hellions or Reapers or something like that, this is a valid option that you can try. So Very, very strong opener. It's pretty common as far as being mixed into pro level games, so you will see that every once in a while. So that's definitely an option you can use if you want to use Roach builds. Let's take a look at another one though that doesn't end quite as abruptly. This is going to be Revival versus Pult, and this is going to be more so about the longer term plan with Roaches. We were talking about how you can eventually switch off Roaches if you want to, but sometimes you can actually just keep going with the Roaches and it can be part of your main army. So like we said, it's going to be Revival versus Pult. We're going to watch him kind of play this out. He's going to hit a fairly similar timing as we saw from the last game, but it's not going to be about bandings. It's going to be more about longer term damage and kind of keeping the Terran's army count minimized. And that's the whole idea with Roaches, if you want to stay on that composition, is that once the Terran starts to figure out what's going on with the Roaches, once they get about 6 tanks or so, your Roaches are going to be absolutely worthless. And that's why part of the idea with these earlier Roach attacks is try to minimize the unit count for the Terran and to stay on top of that the best you can. Note that he's going for 3 gas fairly early. Just starts mining on that one. Going for a lair. And this is actually for Roach speed. So it's a pretty fast lair on 2 bases. He's going to grab Roach speed. He's going to grab some upgrades for his Roaches. And he's going to try to constantly trade over and over and over with the Terran to keep their army size small and keep the Roaches powerful, considering they succeed more in smaller battles. So here comes some Roaches out right now, hitting a very similar timing as before, or at least getting the Roaches out at a similar timing before. He just uses the Roaches to take a 3rd base. He's still going to continue to add on Roaches here, and he's going to start being very aggressive against this Hellion player once again. But no, he's not adding on Banelings. He just continues to add on Roaches here. And he can cancel this mining at this base over here if he really wants to. But mostly he just wants to get fights that are going to favor his Roaches. And the reason why you don't want to wait until you're at huge amounts of supplies is because, once again, once a lot of tanks get on the field, or if they get a lot of Marauders, they will burn through your Roach army really fast. So it's just all about attacking early and often with this type of composition. The only exception is if you start to switch more into Hydralisks. They don't take as much damage from tanks, and or at least, I mean, they're a lot more supply efficient as well. They don't take as much damage from Marauders. They tend to do better against Stim if they have something blocking for them, which is typically these Roaches. So right now Revival is just looking for good fights to pick, and typically you want to get up in their face as fast as you can with your army so you can get as many Roaches firing as possible. So he's going to try to surround here, going to try to deal as much damage. You may lose the Roaches here, but trading them out efficiently for some of the Terran supply is going to be totally worth it. So he's doing his best to try to pick off the Marauders. There are mines starting to come down. He can target them down immediately. Notice he's targeting down the most important aspects of the army as much as he can. And those are always going to be the splash damage or the units that do really well against armored units. So Pult doing pretty nice little cute micro here, but notice how Revival's drone count is fairly low right now. He's only on 52 drones, and he's continuing to make Roaches, and he's continuing to research Carapace upgrades, which is a very interesting idea from Revival. The idea is that if you have Carapace upgrades and they don't have very good Marine upgrades, then their Marines aren't going to do anything against these Roaches, and they will actually be able to tank a lot of damage and therefore stay on the field a lot longer. So this is a pretty cool play from Revival. But the key point here is just the fact that he's keeping Pult on as low of units as possible. He's not just sitting back in his base. He's trying to trade with Pult constantly. And he'll, of course, know when the right time is to go back and kind of regroup if he needs to. And that's usually when the Terran gets a lot of tanks. So this is definitely more of a long-term Roach play. He's going to start up the +1 attack upgrade as well. That attack upgrade is actually going to be more so for a Hydra transition if he wants to make that transition later in the game. But for this game in particular, he does such a good job with his Roach aggression that that phase never really comes. And he just kind of kills Pult with these constant Roach rallies forward. You can see that as the army grows bigger, let's take this as an example here. As this Roach army grows bigger, the Terran army is also going to be bigger. But as you try to attack into chokes like this, only the front half of your Roachers are probably going to be firing at something, while the back half is basically doing nothing. So you might as well only have about this many Roaches if only that many can fire, and these ones might as well not even be there. So this is why the Roaches tend to scale really poorly as the game goes on. But if you can continue to be aggressive and kind of trade out economy, trade out units and stuff for your Roaches, then it'll definitely start to pay off. So he's starting to try to cancel mining down here, and he's just waiting for the Terran to walk down the ramp so all of his Roaches can be engaged here. And he doesn't want to engage into a bad point. You can pull off your Roaches forward and just kind of micro at the Terran, so you just kind of walk forward and attack as you walk forward, just so to make sure all these Roaches back here are firing as well. Typically speaking, the Terran army will have a range advantage on you, so that's why you want to micro forward like that. And we should eventually see that from Revival, but yeah, we're seeing starting to move up. The pulse starts to move away at the exact same time. So getting locked out once again is Revival, but he did do a sufficient amount of damage, and he's starting to break down this wall a little bit. And because of the constant rallies and constant aggression with these Roaches, you can make builds like this work. Just basically a +1 into +2 armor Roach timing, and just staying aggressive constantly while not really making too many drones. 55 drones here, still not a ton, but enough to get the job done. So we're just, Pult's eventually going to die here. The supply lead is now 60 basically for Revival, a little bit less than that now because he lost a couple of units. Here's the Hydra transition now, and eventually the Hydras will be the mainstay of your army. Because their damage comes out so fast, and because you'll typically bait a lot of Marauders, that's why the Hydras are going to be so good. And if Pult honestly really should be making tanks against a play like this, and he's kind of slacking on that. He'd rather go for Marauders instead. Once the tanks start to get to too high of a count, that's when you're going to want to play a little bit more defensively. Maybe consider switching into some other type of unit composition, which you don't really see a lot because you don't typically see a lot of Roach Hydra play. But mostly the idea is about keeping the aggression on, even once you start to mix in Hydras, to be sure that you're getting good trades with your Roaches, and that they're not just sitting around doing nothing when they excel in these smaller scale type of fights. So this is going to go on for quite a while. Let me check the game timer here. Yeah, Pult dies in the next minute or so because Revival just basically surrounds him with Roaches and kills him. Hydra range is on the way, and that's typically the upgrade that you want so they can shoot over top of the Roaches. Eventually you will want Hydra speed. The direction you can actually go with this that's really strong once they get a high tank count is you can start to add on Vipers, and you can either throw down mass blinding clouds and blind their entire army while you attack them, or you can use the Vipers to pull in the tanks so that they're left with only Marine Marauder against heavily upgraded Roach Hydra, which will typically favor you. So that's a good example of a transition if the game were to go longer, and unfortunately there's not many games like that, and this game is going to end very soon. So let's just check out one more replay, and we'll take a look at a slightly different angle as far as using Roaches in this matchup. So this game is going to feature a very old replay, which requires me to have to play it from a different patch level. This doesn't actually impact anything as far as balance going back this far, so this is really just the ghost upgrade and a little bit of mine changes that don't really impact the game too much. They're mostly to change the game against Protoss. But nevertheless, the Roaches don't really care that much about mines considering they're such big units, so it's not even that big of a change. So we'll just wait for this to load, as it typically does take a lot longer to load into older replays for some reason. It's almost like it has to load an older version of the game, which is pretty BM. Yeah, and this is really irritating. So I don't know what to say. I guess here, if this is a good time to say it, is that if you have any questions about anything we've talked about so far, you can just go ahead and post down in the comments and leave me a question. I'm typically pretty good about getting around to those. And if you like the video, definitely subscribe because it does help me out for future endeavors. So this time we're going to see Firecake versus Straylock, and Straylock is very well known to be a meching Terran. And Roaches are a very good response to mech. But we'll see how Straylock, or rather how Firecake wants to use this. Like we've talked about in the past, Roaches are really good on timings, they're really good as far as aggression, and they're good at breaking mech. And I don't know what my game is doing right now, but they're good at breaking mech only if you can have the constant aggression that they require. So Firecake actually opened up with a really fast speed, much faster than the other two players that we saw, because he might actually want to transition into a more standard unit composition after this. That's what I've been alluding to for quite a while, is that you can open up with speed, and you can just make the Roaches to defend against Hellion play, and then switch into more Muta play if you want to, but we are still seeing a decent commitment to Roaches here with a +1 attack. Straylock back in his base, he does have a lot of Hellions right now, he's going to try and surprise Firecake just a tad, but this is why Roaches are so good, because they're really fat. If you can get a lot of them out in conjunction with the Queens, you can kind of create these little pseudo walls that the Hellions have a really hard time breaking down. So this build from the Hellion is basically a blue flame Hellion timing that's going to try to kill a lot of drones and stuff. But if you can get Roaches and Queens in the right position, then the Hellions have a really hard time getting through that, considering their damage is so bad against these big fat armored units. So starting to rally Roaches forward here, and if he crushes a blue flame push like this, then that really weakens his follow-up stages of the game. You can't even use your Roaches back here to wall, and you can see that's exactly what Firecake's starting to set up. And this timing from Strelok was designed to kill a lot of drones and trade well, and it did really basically nothing. So Firecake can add on a lot of drones behind the safety that these Roaches have provided so far. By the way, something interesting as well is these ventral sacks. This is something we haven't talked about yet, especially in the mech video, considering these types of replays are really rare. But this is a cool way to be aggressive with your Roaches, especially if they have a lot of tanks, which we haven't seen quite yet. So, like we've talked about, Terrans are really supposed to get out a lot of tanks against these Roaches, since the splash damage does a lot against them. They get extra damage to armored units, as we can see right there. And overall, tanks are really the best response against Roach plays. So that's what we're seeing out of Strelok right now, and he's kind of doing the right thing, but Firecake's doing something really cool, and that is starting to mix in drop play. Because the idea here is that if you can ever get on top of these tanks and they can't fire, or they hit each other, then that's a good trade for you, and he's throwing away the unit counter that's supposed to win in the game against what you're making. So right now, Firecake's starting to gather up a bunch of overlords that he probably hotkeyed before, and he's going to go for a big Roach drop, and we're going to see that here in just a second. This is one really cool way to break mech. You can't even break bio this way, but it's a lot harder, considering if you lose a lot of overlords before this happens, then that'll be a bad thing. So basically the lesson to get here is that if your opponent is starting to turtle behind tanks, maybe bunkers and walls and stuff like that, using Roach drops is a very effective strategy to try to break that. So starting to see these come through, and we talked about this micro a little bit in the video against Terran, and that is that when these overlords are flying, you can, instead of telling them to drop on a particular location, you can select drop and click on an overlord, and it'll continue to move on the path it was moving on before, but it'll drop it out as it keeps going. So that's what we're seeing here. You can even see a Roach being dropped out midair right now. That's kind of cool. But that's what you'll see from these overlords. You'll see them start to empty, and the Roaches will start to drop out, but they won't stop moving in the direction that they were going to move before, and that's because of that emptying micro that we were talking about. It's just clicking on unload on the overlord that has the Roaches in it will cause it to unload, and it'll just unload as they move. You can see them dropping all over the tanks and stuff right now, and this forces them into a bad situation because they have to unsiege their tanks, and they have to kind of use kind of inferior unit compositions to hold this off. You really do want the safety that siege provides, typically if you're Terran, and that's what the drops tend to nullify. So you can keep doing this over and over and over if you need to. You'll notice he did the first drop right away, and now he's starting up with the second drop, just in case the mech starts to get a little bit more entrenched, with the siege tanks and whatnot. He's starting to add on banelings here, and this doesn't have to be your only play. He can start going into a more normal game with Spire and whatnot, but he can also drop banelings on top of this if he really wants to, although that's not usually as efficient. So this is the situation we're talking about. Typically the Terran's going to want to start sieging up a lot of these tanks, and if you drop on top of the siege tanks, and there's not really a whole lot they can do about that. You can try to unsiege, but that tank was basically not firing the entire time. The tank's back here, if you can get on top of them, then that'll be perfect. But considering he's been so aggressive with these Roaches and he's been able to whittle them down, now he can just rally forward, and that'll basically end the game. So really the whole lesson here is that as the game goes on, your Roaches are going to get worse and worse, considering they're so supply bloated. They have such bad range, and they die against a lot of different Terran units. So if you really want to do Roach strategies, you have to be willing to be aggressive basically all the time with these things. And I hope that these replays at least gave you guys some good ideas as far as different builds and stuff you can try against Terran. So hope you enjoyed that. Leave me a comment down below if you have any questions. There are more Zerg tutorials in the description of the video if you want to check those out. I'll be back with more videos very soon, so until then, take care.